Hey, what's up? This is Caleb Ward with VFX City, and in this quick tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create this cool nebula effect. Alright, so before we get started, I want to encourage you to go download the free project file over on my website. You can find a link in the description below. So of course, the first thing we want to do is go to Composition, New Composition, and we'll call this composition Final Comp, and make sure it's 24 frames per second, 1920 by 1080, and instead of 20 seconds long, we'll do 5 seconds, and hit OK. Now let's go ahead and create a new solid. So just go to Layer, New, Solid, and we'll just call this BG for background, and make sure that the solid is completely black, and hit OK and OK. Now it's time to create our first star layer. Now to do that, just go to Layer, New, Solid, and we'll make sure that it's white, and in this case I actually want it to be square, so I'm going to do 1920 by 1920, and we can change the name to Star 1 and hit OK. To create the stars, simply go to the effects browser and type in CC star, and you'll see starburst, and go ahead and drag that to your white layer. Now obviously these stars are a little too big. Well, let's turn the size down to maybe about 25 and click away. And unfortunately, by default, the stars, they kind of move like you're traveling through space, which is a cool effect, but it's not exactly what we want for this composition. Instead, we want the stars to be still. So I'm going to change the speed to 0. So now if we scrub through, we can see that the stars stay completely still. Now go ahead and duplicate your star layer and go to the scatter and just turn it up. So now we have just kind of another random set of stars. And this is going to come in handy in a little bit later whenever we go in and stylize our project. Now that we have 2 star layers created, let's go to the effects browser and type in glow. So let's drag over a glow effect. So now that you have the glow effect applied, go ahead and solo that top star layer so we can see what's going on. And let's zoom in here and change the glow colors to AB colors. And let's change both colors to just kind of a brighter blue. And what we're trying to do here is really just simulate what real stars look like in the night sky. So I'm going to zoom in here, and let's go ahead and turn up the intensity to about 3. And we can turn up the threshold to maybe around 40. So we just want to begin to see a little bit of this blue color seeping through. And if we zoom out, we can see that some of our stars have this slight blue glow to them, and that's perfect. So let's go ahead and duplicate the star layer one more time, and let's change the scatter to just a different number to where we have just another random star scatter amount, and let's change the colors from blue to a little bit of a desaturated red right about here, and we can use our color picker to select the same red there. Cool, so now some of the stars are red and some of the stars are blue, and this is just to simulate a realistic night sky. We're going to go to Layer, New, Solid, and it can be a white solid, and we'll call this Nebula, and we'll do Nebula Left. And we can make this comp size, so 1920 by 1080, and white, and hit OK. So the effect that we're going to want to use is called turbulent noise. And you might be familiar with the counterpart effect, fractal noise. Both of these effects work in a very similar way, but I tend to like turbulent noise just a little bit better. So let's go ahead and turn up the contrast to somewhere around 450 to 500. So maybe right about there. And let's turn up the brightness to about 50. Awesome. And as you can see, this doesn't really look like the type of texture you would see in a nebula. Perhaps the dusty stars around the nebula, but not necessarily the nebula itself. So let's go to the fractal type and change it to dynamic progressive. And now you can see we're beginning to get some of these arms here that kind of will create the shape of the overall nebula. So let's do a little more tweaking here. Let's go to the transform options, turn off uniform scaling, and let's scale up the width. We want it to be just a little bit wider than it is tall. It's right about there, and we can change the offset to where we can kind of pick which part of this effect we want the actual nebula to come from. And I'm kind of liking this area right here. So what we can do is go to our mask here and just kind of cut out kind of the area that we want our final nebula to be. Cool, and let's hit the F key, or you could simply go to the drop-down menu here, go to mask, and then feather, but really that F key, that keyboard shortcut, is super helpful whenever doing this type of work. And let's turn up the feathering to maybe about 200. Yeah, right about there. And the last quick update that I want to do to the turbulent noise here is go to your subsettings, and we can turn this subscaling down just a little bit. And we're just wanting to add in just a little more detail to make this look a little more complex. So the next effect we want to add in is an invert effect. And let's go ahead and drag that invert effect over to the turbulent noise. And as you can see, the colors are now reversed. So now let's go in and add a Bezier warp. So Bezier, and drag it onto our nebula. So this is a great effect in After Effects for creating distorted or organic looking layers. So what you can do is go in and just kind of grab the arms and shape this layer as you want it. And this is so much better than using different effects like the liquefy effects, because it works in real time. So we're just adjusting this layer as we see fit. We can just adjust the edges here, just like that. And what I want is, I'm trying to create a good composition where this left nebula kind of leads into the right nebula and kind of ends in this kind of golden ratio style nebula look. So we're just going to go ahead and grab these. We can move the nebula around to right about there, and let me go ahead and grab kind of the edge here to right about there. And you can finesse this as much as you want, but I think for right now this is looking really good. And let's add in one last effect. This effect is going to be called a tritone, and go ahead and drag the tritone onto the nebula. Now the default colors won't work, so let's go to the highlights button here and select just kind of a desaturated light yellow. And for the midtones, let's go find kind of a middle of the road desaturated blue, about there. You know what, let's add in one more effect. So let's add in a fast blur effect to our nebula, and we'll turn this up to about 2. And that's just to cut out on some of the sharpness, because nebulas aren't typically super sharp. They're usually have a little bit of softness to them, and maybe 2's too much. Let's do 1 and kind of zoom out here. So as you can see, you can't see behind the nebula, so these stars aren't peeking through the dark parts of the nebula. And if this is the look that you want, that's perfectly fine, but for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to hit the toggle switches button here and change the transfer mode to screen. So now you can see that the dark parts are see-through and the light parts are not quite as opaque. This is exactly what we want. Now this is looking good for our first nebula, but the second one we want it to be even more over the top. So let's go ahead and duplicate this nebula and hit enter, and we'll call this Nebula Right, and click away. So let's go ahead and drag this second nebula kind of up here to the corner, right about here, and let's go to our transform properties here and offset the turbulence. So you can click on this little arrow here, and you can just kind of begin to drag this around until you see just kind of a batch of nebula that you like. Just dragging this around, and let's say we want this one right here. So this is looking cool, and what I can do is go in and grab the edges of this mask here and just kind of open it up to where we're kind of creating a little bit bigger nebula for the second one here. We're just dragging the edges of our mask just to make the nebula a little bit bigger. And we can go to our Bezier warp here and adjust it as we need. So for the second nebula, we kind of want it to be a little bit fatter. We don't want it to take up the entire frame and completely dwarf the second nebula, but we do want it to be fairly large. And so we can just go in and drag it as needed. Cool, and that's pretty good. And let's go into our color here and change the midtones to kind of a magenta color right about there. and hit OK. Now you can see that these nebulas don't look like they're blending well together. So one fix would be maybe perhaps we go into this blue nebula here and go to the transform, and we could scale up the width a little bit more. It's maybe right about there to where it kind of looks like it's getting sucked into the second nebula. And maybe the second nebula, this kind of magenta nebula on the right, perhaps we don't want it to be as stretched out. Maybe this one is kind of more of a cloud, and perhaps the blue one is kind of invading this cloud or pulling away from this cloud. So let's go in and change the width to maybe something skinnier than 200, maybe about 150. And we could go and turn down the brightness just a little bit, maybe just about maybe down to like 43. That's just going to fill in this nebula just a little bit more. And again, we can go in with the Bezier handles and just adjust it as we need. And adjust the mask if it gets too crazy. We just want it to blend as well as possible to the nebula on the left. And again, this is a big part about working in After Effects. You're always going to have to just spend time finessing your project to make it look as good as possible. So we're just going to go in here and just adjust our handles. And the cool thing about working on projects like this is, you know, they don't have to all look exactly the same. We can have each one of our nebulas look a little bit different, and the end results will still be awesome. So now it's looking like these nebulas are kind of blending into each other a little bit more. And I'm actually going to go in and turn down the contrast on the nebula on the right. And we'll turn down the brightness just a bit more. Right about, let's say, 25, and click away. So now that we have the base of our nebula created, now it's time to create the clouds that will make up the background. So creating the clouds is actually pretty easy. So let's go ahead and duplicate our nebula right and just select it and hit Command D. And of course, you don't want the nebula to be the exact same shape. So let's go ahead and turn up the evolution, maybe to about 130, so it's a different shape. And we can turn up the brightness to about 50. Now let's go in and solo our second nebula right here. And I'm just going to select it and do Nebula Cloud 1 and hit enter. And let's go in and turn up our fast blur to about 25. Right in there, and let's duplicate this cloud one more time. And for this one, we're going to go into our transform options and just kind of turn down the scaling. Just keep turning it down, maybe about there, and we can turn up the evolution to about 270. And again, let's turn up the brightness just slightly, just to where we have a completely different shape. And then we can go in and even adjust the handles of our mask here just to give us a completely new and original shape. And let's turn off the solo so we can kind of see what's going on. So as you can see, there's beginning to get some clouds behind this nebula here. And if we kind of click and drag, you can see where they are and what they look like. Excellent. And we actually want our nebula clouds to extend beyond the nebula itself. So let's select our nebula cloud 1, and we can kind of drag this up to where it's stretching beyond our nebula cloud here. And then let's go ahead and select both of these guys and turn down the opacity by about, let's say 50%, and just kind of drop down the menu here. So now there's just kind of this cloud surrounding the nebula, and this is just going to make it a little more realistic. So the next thing we want to do is actually create a glowing background for both our left and right nebula. So go ahead and hit Command Y, and we'll just call this BG Cloud Right. And let's select just a bright color. Let's say bright pink, just kind of like a hot pink. Click OK and OK. And let's turn down the opacity. I just hit T, and we can turn it down to about 50% and go to our pen selection tool here. And we're just going to go in and just kind of cut out just kind of where we think the background should be. Something about like that. Hit the F key and feather it out. Something right about there. And go ahead and drop it below all the nebulas. Excellent. So as you can see, it is a little bright. So let's go ahead and turn down the opacity to, we'll say about 24. And let's create a new solid. Hit Command Y. And for this one, we'll do BG Cloud Left and change the color to just a deep blue, something about like that, and hit OK. And again, select your pen tool or hit the G key and just go in and kind of cut out around the edges of where this blue nebula should be. And hit F to feather it out. It's right about there, and you can just adjust it as needed, and hit T for opacity and turn it down to, for this one we can do about 50%, and click away. Now it's time to add in the star into our right nebula here. To do that, hit Command Y. We'll call this new layer Big Star and select white. Hit OK and OK. Now let's go ahead and turn down the opacity so we can kind of see what's going on here. And let's create an elliptical shape. We don't want it to be perfectly circle, but we do want it to be kind of roundish. So maybe about there. And let's zoom out and turn the opacity back up to 100%. So obviously this won't work as a star. It's a little too obvious. So let's select it and hit F to feather it out. And we can just feather the edges to about 20. We just want it to be just ever so slight. And let's go to the effects browser and type in turbulent displace and apply it to the big star. So if you're not already familiar with turbulent displace, it is an indispensable After Effects effect. So we're going to go in and turn up the amount to about 125 and turn up the complexity quite a bit. So we can turn up the complexity to, let's say about 3.3, just right before it starts to just completely fall apart, and we can scale this up as we need it, just to kind of create a star that's a little bit bigger. And let's go ahead and drag it right in the middle here. I see this center area here is a good place to put it, and change the transfer mode to add. Now you can see that our star is a little sharp around the edges here. So to fix that, we're going to go to our effects browser and type in fast and drag fast blur onto the big star. Turn up the blurriness to about 40. And hit repeat edge pixels just in case you're bleeding over the edges, and click away. So right now our nebula is a little too perfect. So let's go in and add some dusty outlines to make it look a little more natural. We're going to hit Command Y to create a new solid, and we'll call this Edge 1, and let's select black as our color. Hit OK and OK. Now let's go to our pen tool here and just kind of cut out an edge for our composition. So it doesn't have to be any shape in particular, but what's important is that you're just kind of cutting out the edges as you see fit. And if you hit the M key, you'll see your mask, and we can change the mask mode to subtract. Now let's go in and solo our layer here and turn on the transparent background button. Now, in our previous tutorial, we used an effect called turbulent displace, and I didn't really talk a lot about what turbulent displace does, but in a nutshell, turbulent displace will distort the edges of any layer you put it on. So this is a great effect, obviously, for creating just distorted edges and any sort of like extra fractals that you need in your composition that fractal noise or turbulent noise can't create. So in our case, I'm going to go into the amount, and we're going to crank this up to about 400, and for the size, we're going to turn it up to a significant amount, maybe about 250. And we're going to turn up the complexity quite a bit. We're just going to keep cranking this until we just get some crazy looking fractals. Something about like this. This is looking pretty good. And so now we can go in and just kind of adjust the edges to where we want basically some fractals like these here, just that are kind of skinny in nature. We don't want these big dark black splotches that look like cow print. We really want these just kind of softer, more organic fractals in our scene. So something about like this. And we're just gonna go in and just adjust as needed to the edge here. Cool. And let's go ahead and set our transfer mode to overlay and hit T and turn the opacity down to about 50. So now let's go in and add in a fast blur. So the fast blur is really just going to soften up these edges because we don't want them to be so sharp that it draws attention to them. Let's turn it up until the edges are slightly softened. So about there. So that's a level of 2. And let's create another solid. So hit Command Y and we'll call this Edge Matte and hit OK. And let's type in turbulent noise and apply it to our layer here. So go into contrast and turn it up. And go ahead and turn off the solo for the edge matte and the eyeball. And let's change our track matte to Luma Matte. So now you can see that our edge kind of has this fuzziness to it. And that's because the luminance of our edge 1 is actually being taken from this layer right here. So any part that is white will go ahead and show through, and any part that's black will be 100% transparent. So as you can see, we just have this like fuzziness here, and we can go into our edge matte and turn up the contrast even more, and we can turn down the brightness until we get an effect that is right for us. Cool, right about there. And in fact, I'm going to turn up the brightness just a little bit more so more of the edge kind of spills through. And let's turn off the solo layer just so that we can see what's going on. So as you can see, if you zoom into the nebula here, there's just kind of these kind of extra dark dust objects, and these are really just helping to sell this effect. And I could see that perhaps we want to go into our edge 1 and maybe blur it out a little bit more. We could maybe turn this up to about 6 just to add in a little extra dust. So let's go ahead and duplicate both of these layers. Hit Command D to duplicate, and for our edge 1 here, we're going to go to our turbulent displace and just kind of turn up the evolution. So now we can see that the dust is kind of popping up in a different place, and let's go ahead and select both of these layers again and hit Command D and select the edge 1. We can change the evolution again, and perhaps we could even go into our edge matte and we could turn down the contrast and turn up the evolution on that layer too. And then we could even go into our edge 1 right here and grab the edge and just kind of drag it over until we see a little bit more dust introduced into the scene. And we can do that to all the edges here, including this kind of bottom area down here. So now we're just dragging in dust into our nebula, and this is just making it look a little more realistic. We can grab the edge here. So now we have this dust that's kind of creeping its way into our nebula, and it's just giving it an overall more realistic effect. So I'm going to hold down Command and select all 3 of our edges here, and let's turn down the opacity a little bit more. Maybe to about 25%. Go ahead and click the arrows over here, and let's zoom out. Excellent. So while the effect is quite subtle, it definitely adds a lot to the believability of this scene. So the last thing we want to do is actually just create a standard vignette. So hit Command Y, and we'll call this vignette. And we'll make sure that it's 1920 by 1080 and it's black. Hit OK. And let's go to our handy dandy pen tool and just kind of cut out some edges here. So for this layer, we're not going to apply the turbulent displace effect. This is just going to be a standard feather. So let's go to the drop-down menu, go to mask, drop-down menu one more time, set the mask mode to subtract and feather out the edges. So we're just trying to kind of soften the edges here to make it just dark around the edges to where our focus is drawn to the center of the frame here. Excellent. You can just grab the edges as you need. Excellent. So now the audience's attention is kind of drawn more towards the center of our scene to this nebula. And in fact, I actually want to turn down the opacity of this vignette. We don't want it to be at 100%. Perhaps we want it to be at about 75%. No motion graphic sequence would be complete without a lens flare. So let's add one in. Simply hit Command Y to create a new solid, and we'll call this Flare 1. We'll make sure that it's 1920 by 1080, and let's go in and select just kind of a bright blue color here. hit OK and OK. So go to your rectangle tool here, and we're going to just kind of create a long rectangle, maybe about there, and hit the F key for feather and deselect this chain. And this is just going to allow you to feather off in X space, and then we're going to turn up the Y space just a little bit to where, you know, the edges are just a little bit soft. And let's go ahead and drag this over the center of the eye of our nebula here, and go to your pan behind tool, and let's move the anchor point to right in the center here. And now if we go to scale, we can scale it down to about the right size. So we scaled it down to about 43%. So in a nutshell, we want the lens flare to go from this edge to this edge. So that looks pretty good, and we'll set the transfer mode to add. Now this is pretty bright. It's drawing maybe a little too much attention to it, so I'm going to select the flare, go to opacity, and change it to about 50%. So now that we have a lens flare set for the purple nebula, let's go ahead and add in one for the blue nebula. To do that, let's go ahead and hit Command D with our flare selected and hit the P key, and then we can just adjust the position to where it's centered up just right in line with kind of a bright point in our blue nebula. And we can go in and turn down the opacity to about 30%. And you can see that was just a quick way to add in lens flares into our composition. All right, so the time has come. It's time to animate this composition. So to do that, we're going to toggle the switch here and select all of our layers by hitting Command A, and go ahead and select the 3D checkbox. And go ahead and hit this drop down menu just to kind of collapse all of our layers here. And we can go to our background and just deselect the 3D because we want our background to be black and solid no matter what happens. So we don't want all of our layers to be the same distance in 3D space, but we'll worry about that in just a minute. First, we're going to create a new camera. So go to Layer, New Camera. And this camera, we want it to be 50 millimeters. We can just use the preset, and camera 1 is fine, and hit OK. So let's go to Layer, New, Null Object, set the null object to 3D, and then use our pick whip tool to parent the camera to the null object. And we can just call this camera movement. So now we can adjust this camera movement null object, and the camera will move with it. So let's go ahead and drag our current time indicator or our playhead to the end of the composition and set a position keyframe for the camera movement. Let's move back to the very beginning, and we'll zoom in Z space. We'll zoom in all the way into our star here. So we'll just have to adjust the null object and adjust the X and Y to line up perfectly. And then once we're lined up, we can just turn up the Z space until the entire frame is filled with bright white. So something about like that. So now if we scrub through, we can see it kind of zooms out from that single point in the nebula. So obviously we want this movement to be smoother. So I'm going to select the keyframe and hit the little graph editor button here. So let's go in and kind of create a hill here. So we want it to speed up towards the beginning and slow down towards the end. So it just kind of slowly zooms out and just kind of speeds up and smoothly comes to rest. Excellent. So now let's go in and add in a little camera rotation. So let's select our camera, go to the drop-down menu, and set a keyframe for the Z rotation. Scrub to the very beginning and change the Z rotation to 90%. So now if we scrub through, we can see that our camera kind of spins 45 degrees and comes to rest. Excellent. So the rotation is right, but the speed at which it rotates is all wrong. So I'm going to go into our camera movement here, and you can see that by selecting it in our graph editor, we can see that the fastest point is right about here. So it's at 13 frames. So let's go ahead and select the Z rotation, and we're going to have it rotate with a similar curve. So let's go in and create a curve just like we did before, and we want the peak of the curve to be right at 13 frames. So right about there. So now if we kind of zoom out here, we see that it rotates and comes to rest. And in fact, I don't think I want it to rotate completely 90 degrees. Let's turn this down to maybe about 65 degrees. And if we go ahead and scrub through here, we can see that the galaxy just kind of slowly zooms out and comes to rest. So one thing you'll notice is our lens flare has the same orientation the entire time the camera's rotating, and that's of course completely different than the way lens flares really work in camera. So to fix this, I'm going to select our flare for the center of our nebula. I'm going to hit R and set a keyframe for the Z rotation at the very end. And let's scrub forward to the very beginning, and we're going to rotate this 66 degrees so that it matches the camera perfectly. And let's go in again and create a curve. So we want the curve to match the curve of the camera perfectly. So let's move forward to 13 frames, and again we're just trying to match up the rotation of the camera with the rotation of the lens flare. So now if we click away and scrub through, we can see that the lens flare orients towards the camera as the camera comes to rest. Cool. So another thing that we're going to want to keyframe is the actual nebulas themselves. So let's go ahead and collapse our menus here, and we'll select our first nebula. We'll do the left nebula, and right now our nebula is completely still. But what we can do is set keyframes for all of these Bezier handles here, scrub forward to the very beginning, and change the camera to front. And this is just a camera view without the 3D camera properties, but we'll change it back in a second. So what you can do now is change this so that as the composition progresses, the nebula just slowly pushes in. And again, this is a nebula, so it moves kind of slow, and we want the effect to be kind of subtle. So I think for this composition, that simple movement is all we want. So let's go in to our nebula right and do the exact same thing. So I'm going to go to the 5-second mark and set a keyframe for all of the Bezier warp stopwatches. Go to the very beginning, and we can just adjust this nebula, just kind of pull it out. So now both of the nebulas just kind of push in closer together towards the end. It's just like they're getting sucked into one another. Cool. And let's change our view back to active camera. So now we see we have this scene where it kind of zooms out and slowly comes to rest. Now, the problem is the stars in the background move at the exact same speed as the nebula, but we would expect the stars to be further back in space. So to move them back, we're going to go ahead and select all the stars, hit the P key, and we're just going to crank up the Z space to just a lot. We're going to crank it up to about 10,000. Just keep on going here. Right about there, and hit the S key for scale, and go ahead and scale up the stars. So now the background looks completely the same, but as we zoom in, we can see that the stars zoom out at a different rate than the nebula, and this is just going to create a cool parallaxing effect. So now we are 90% there. Let's add in some finishing touches. So the first thing we're going to do is go to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, and we're not going to make this adjustment layer 3D, and let's go ahead and rename this adjustment layer Glow. And as you guessed, we're going to add in a glow effect to the glow adjustment layer. So right off the bat, you can see we're getting some pretty cool results, but I'm going to go in and turn up the radius to right about there, to where you can see that the sun is just blown out and the edges just kind of have a little bit more of a glow to them. And let's turn down the threshold just a little bit to right about there. So now this just gave our scene a little more tenacity. And let's create a new solid. So hit Command Y, and we'll call this a new solid overlay. And the width is 1920, the height we want to be 1920 as well, and it can be blue, that's fine. We're going to change the colors anyway, and hit OK. And we want this one to be in 3D, so just go ahead and select the 3D button. And let's go to our effects browser here and type in gradient ramp and apply it to the overlay. So obviously this won't do, and we're going to have to change our transfer mode to overlay. And let's set the first color to right in the middle of the nebula here, and let's set the second color to right in the middle of the blue nebula right here. So obviously this is not the look we're going for. So I'm gonna go set the start color to just a bright pink, maybe something about like that. Hit OK, and we'll set the end color to a blue, maybe about right there. And this is really just going in and adding just a little more blue and a little more pink to the surrounding areas. So hit the T key and turn down the opacity to about 50%. So now you can see that the stars on this side are a little more magenta and the stars on this side are a little more blue. And that's all there really is to this effect. If you wanted to, you could go in and customize your nebulas as you need. You know, for example, we could go in and maybe turn down the brightness on one of our clouds to make it a little more soft along the edges. We could even go into, let's say, our nebula, and if we wanted to make it more contrasted, we could, and just turn it up to where, you know, there's just some brighter edges, but it all depends on your personal preference. So I'm just gonna go in here and just as I see fit, I'm just gonna kind of grab some edges and kind of pull them out just to make the effect look custom for my specific project. Kind of click away here. So the last thing that I want to do, and this is the very last thing, is I'm going to go ahead and select all of our layers here, deselect the graph editor, and go to the toggle switch button here and turn on motion blur. And let's turn on motion blur right here. And that's just going to create a more realistic motion blur as the camera zooms out in 3D space. All right, and that's about it. If you want to learn more about this technique or After Effects in general, go check out my website at VFX City. This has been Caleb Ward. We'll see you next time.